Hi there and welcome to part 1 of the PMBOK Planning Group tutorial from Projex Academy, where you'll be learning how to master the 23 planning processes along with harnessing the power of Microsoft Project. My name is Dave Litton and I'm the founder of the Projex Academy. So let's make a start. First of all, I want to share 3 slides with you covering the various process groups and knowledge areas. You'll be familiar with these, of course, and what I'm showing you here are contained within the matrix within the PMBOK guide itself. And as I've said, this tutorial will be focusing on the planning process group alone. So merely by way of a summary, I just want to remind you of the processes that you and I will be working through here. Starting off with the Develop Project Management Plan, which is part of Integration Management. All these other processes will combine together in order to be integrated within the project management plan itself. Here I'm showing the first 3 knowledge areas. Here's the next 4 knowledge areas. I just want you to focus on the planning processes, starting off with plan cost management, going through to plan communications management, and then finally, again focusing on the planning process areas. Here we are looking at the risk management, procurement management, and stakeholder management knowledge areas. One of the questions I get very regularly from folks who are preparing for their PMP exam is the sequence in which all of these planning processes get performed in a real project. And understanding exactly how that happens can help you get a far better grasp on exactly what planning against the PMBOK guide really is. And as you can see, planning forms over half of the processes. So get a grip on these and you're halfway there to preparing for your exam, if you see the point I'm making. But one of the most common questions I get from folks preparing for PMP is what exactly is the sequence of carrying these out? And it certainly isn't the sequence in which the knowledge areas are laid out on this standard matrix. So providing an answer to that question is what this tutorial is all about. But of course, once you've taken and passed your PMP exam, you'll be wanting to apply this back in the workplace. And these aspects are not often covered in normal PMP training events. And neither is how you would actually go about this. And I'm referring here to using the power of a planning and management tool such as Microsoft Project. So I shall also be introducing how that should happen as I go through the remainder of this training. And before I move on to the next slide, I'm sure you've heard of ITTOs. Those dreaded things that you seem to have to memorize before you can sit your exam. They stand for inputs, tools, techniques, and outputs. And what I want to focus on there is the inputs and outputs. And what most training misses entirely is the difference between an input and an output and the sequence in which processes should be carried out. Well, I'm going to clear all of that up in this video. To make the point here, let me take perform quantitative risk analysis. If you refer to the PMBOK guide, you'll certainly see what information needs to be presented as an input and what information you will have generated on an output from this particular process. But that really doesn't give you much evidence to help you think through the actual sequence that all of these processes should be carried out in. And of course, there's a great deal of progressive elaboration and iteration done in a real-world project when you're carrying out the planning, and I'll be touching on that as well. I am referring here, of course, to the PMBOK 5th edition guide, as I'm recording this at the end of 2017. In March 2018, all exams will be based on the 6th edition, and there will be some small changes to some of these processes. But for now, there are actually 47 of them. And of those 47 processes, 24 of them all fall within the planning process group. I list them again here just for your easy reference. And it's when students run their eyes down all of these that their eyes begin to glaze over and think, my goodness me, I'll never get to really understand how these all work together. And I'm sure you've picked up already that this is around half of the 47 PMBOK processes alone that form the all-important planning process group. So to start on our journey of demystifying all this, I want to first of all cover another topic which is often glossed over. So I want to ask you a question. Does your organisation use phases for its projects? And if so, some or all of the 47 processes may take place in each phase. So if you've got a project with 4 phases, many of these 47 processes will be used time and again within each phase. Don't forget, of course, that many of these processes may be performed in parallel with other processes. And another fact that won't have escaped your attention is that the outputs of one process are often used as inputs into one or more of the other processes. But be clear, the inputs and outputs are not the same as sequence, which is what I want to clarify here. So let's just first of all look at the process groups for a simple project. I'm sure you'll be familiar with this. Here you would have the start of a project, you have the initiating process group, then the planning process group, and those would certainly normally be done in series, and then you have the executing and monitoring and controlling process groups, pretty much being carried out in an iterative manner. But then ultimately, as you get towards the end of the project, you use the closing process group in order to shut the project down in a controlled manner. But when your project is split into more than one phase, then this whole sequence may be carried out more than once. Let me demonstrate for you. Let's have a look at the process groups in a multiple phase project. You may name your phases, for example, design phase, test phase, installation phase, and so on and so forth. Here's what it might look like. So here would be phase 1, and there's our diagram again, showing start with initiating through to closing, and then you have what's typically known as the gate review. In other words, you evaluate the project and decide whether or not to proceed through the gate to the next phase. Just to keep this simple, let's assume there's one more in this project and it's phase 2. And once again, here's where you go through your initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, controlling, and ultimately closing. So that the closing in this point in phase 1 would be close phase, whereas the closing here would be closed project, since it's the last phase in the project. And what I'm leading into here is something which the PMBOK guide, and therefore neither the PMP exam, goes into too much detail. So let me elaborate. Looking now at process products, here's the diagram which you will be familiar with. The initiating processes within the initiating process group, and over here the closing processes within the closing process group. In the middle you have planning, executing, and monitoring and controlling, usually done in an iterative fashion. And a phrase you'll be familiar with is that the scope of the project is, as PMBOK calls it, progressively elaborated, meaning that some processes are performed iteratively and key documents, such as the project plan, are elaborated throughout the project as more and more information becomes known. So here's the piece which you won't be so familiar with, and I want to provide you with an approach that you'll find helpful. Going back to the matrix of the process groups and the knowledge areas, you'll remember there was a process called Develop Project Management Plan. Well, let's imagine it's happened, and here it is. Now within this document, as my graphic infers, it's not necessarily one document. It could indeed be several documents. And continuing that thought, let's suppose that you have a 3-phase project. So here is what I would suggest needs to happen. Now within the project management plan is the project plan, which of course what one would expect to cover at a fairly high level, phase 1, phase 2 and phase 3. But as you and I both know, it's impossible to plan the whole project at one sitting. Almost certainly project plan will need to be refined as it goes through the various phases. And the normal way to achieve this is to have both a project level plan and a more detailed plan for each phase level, and that might look something like this. So here I've called this the phase 1 plan, and it covers from the start of phase 1 through to the end of it, quite naturally. So what you'd want to do is to take the high level project plan and using the high level information within phase 1 of that, develop your phase 1 plan. And you've guessed it, what you'd want to be using here is the planning process, the executing process, and the monitoring and controlling process to then carry out that plan. So I want you to imagine you're now approaching the end of phase 1. This would be another gate point here where you'd need to get approval to proceed to phase 2. And the managers who are responsible for agreeing whether you should proceed or not, very often your sponsor, will need to make a decision at that gate point whether or not the project should continue into phase 2. So part of the evidence you'll need to provide for that, you've guessed it, would be the phase 2 plan. In other words, once more, you'll go into the project plan and you'll break the high-level phase 2 information down into sufficient detail to carry out the day-to-day management of phase 2. And then once more, of course, you're into the executing, monitoring and controlling. And therefore exactly the same thing will happen as you approach the end of phase 2. And as before, you'll carry out the executing, monitoring, controlling processes within phase 3, and the cycle continues. but there's still some detail missing. So let's you and I go through phase 1 in a little more detail. Here we are with the project management plan again. We take the project plan and we split it into detail. And to repeat again, we need to take the project plan high level information and to create a more detailed phase 1 plan. But of course, we're using PMBOK here, and we therefore need to use the initiating processes for phase 1. And here's the phase 1 plan. It's here you will use the planning process group to create this level of plan, and its duration will cover the whole of phase 1. But although I'm focusing on the planning group here, let's just remember there are two processes within the initiating process. The first is called Develop Project Charter, and this is done at project level. And the second is to identify your stakeholders. But when we're down at the phase levels, we obviously don't need to develop the project charter again. But as more detail emerges, it's highly likely you'll want to update the statement of work, which forms part of the project charter. There's a business case within it. Again, this will need to be refined at each phase boundary. But what about updating any agreements? These are often contracts. You may have a third party involved, for example, in one of the several phases. And if appropriate, you'd want to update these too. Now, the other process that's within the initiating process group is called Identify Stakeholders. And you should be checking here to see if within this phase there are any new or modified stakeholders involved. Those involved within the project team themselves may also be changed. Having done that, we're now into the executing process, which I won't go into any detail in this video, and then the monitoring and controlling process. And we know that the executing process is carried out first, and then you monitor and control progress. As a result of doing that, you'll normally need to go back and carry out the executing process again. And sometimes, as a result of monitoring and controlling, you'll recognise the need to go back and modify the plan in some way. And so this continues for the rest of that particular phase. And then we come to the closing processes. Now in the PMBOK guide, although it says this is for either closing the project or a phase, in this case we're talking about closing a phase. And it could well be that you have now a final product or a service or a result being passed into operational use at the end of this particular phase. This of course would be very typical within a project that's using phased delivery. And it may be, as a result of phase 1, but not phase 2, your third party or contracts need to be closed down. In this case, this also is where for this particular phase, you will need to close such procurements. And as I showed you in the previous slide, you now want to prepare the phase 2 plan using the planning process for the next phase. And here you can see your partially assembled product, which the next phase will build upon. And so it continues. And something that you'll already be familiar with is the fact that within the project management plan, you'll have 11 plans covering different aspects of the project: scope management, requirements management, and so on and so forth. These are called plans, but in fact, they're really strategies. So just picking one here, the risk management plan shows you how you intend to manage risk throughout the project. So generally, the strategies would not change as you go through each phase. But the question I want to ask you is, if these are strategies, where's all the normal stuff you'd expect to see? Where's your activities and where's your resources? And of course, these all get created during the planning process group, but it's not obvious when you look at the standard matrix within the PMBOK guide. So let me elaborate. Let me take you through this as a series of sequential steps. So the first thing within your project you would want to do is to develop your project charter. And I've shown that as a dotted line since it's within the initiating process group rather than the planning process group, which is where I'm focusing. So the first process you would want to use here is the plan scope management process. Now when we talk about project scope, we are referring to the work that's needed to successfully complete the project, and making sure it's that work and no other. Getting a solid grasp of exactly what's included will help you create a realistic and achievable project management plan. And although there are 6 processes within the scope management knowledge area, this is the only one that falls within planning, which in sequence terms brings us to step 2, which is collect requirements. And this process focuses on understanding what exactly is needed in order to satisfy all of your stakeholders. The next logical sequence step is to then go on to define the scope. And this process refines the requirements that you have collected here. by carrying out additional analysis. Bringing us to step number 4, which is creating the work breakdown structure. This is significant, as you can see by the colour I've used here. And it's here in step 4 that you create what is known as the scope baseline, which happens to include the work breakdown structure. And you could argue this is one of the most important components of the project plan, where you would break down the project deliverables into progressively smaller components. I'm sure you're familiar with what it looks like. So it's at this point I want to introduce the Microsoft Project Planning tool, as although you may well create the work breakdown structure within a planning workshop, usually using yellow post-it notes, you'll certainly want to create at least 2 Microsoft Project files, and one of them is to store your work breakdown structure. Again, it might be counterintuitive, but it's one thing to have your work breakdown structure captured electronically, if you will, and it's another thing altogether to want to show it as a schedule. So what you'll want to do is to brainstorm within a workshop your work breakdown structure, usually using post-it notes or something similar. And you then want to capture that in one of your 2 Microsoft Project files. And here I've shown what it might look like. It's merely taking this hierarchical diagram and representing it as an indented list. Now, just because this shows the structure of the project, it doesn't in any way relate to the sequence, as I'll demonstrate shortly. But you would use this as a basis for generating your project schedule. And here's what you might typically have. This is a partially completed example of a work breakdown structure. One of the important things to do here is to accurately name your levels. As you'll see, it helps enormously for monitoring control later, and stops the ambiguity of accidentally creating 2 activities with the same name. So what you'd want to do here, combining this, here I'm showing you simply a picture of a traditional hierarchical diagram, normally created in a workshop and then entered into Microsoft Project as an indented list, as I'm showing you here. Now this is quite important, because once you have this within a project file, you'll have a great deal of power, because all of your product deliverables, your work breakdown structure levels, your start and finish dates which you've yet to generate, the work effort which you've yet to generate, the duration of each activity, the cost of each activity, and of work breakdown structure nodes, are all examples of what you can filter or sort by in Microsoft Project, allowing you instant and accurate decisions and actions when it comes to the monitoring and controlling process group. And here's a little snapshot example of what a node, as it's called, on the work breakdown structure might look like. Now, over the past few years, the PMBOK guide has moved quite correctly towards recognizing that what you should be focusing on at the higher levels of your work breakdown structure are the products or deliverables. And you break these down into levels that would normally be represented at a work package level. Because this is just an example here, I'm showing you the typical information that you could store within Microsoft Project after you have brainstormed this in a workshop. You can see here immediately some of the key elements. Although we've yet to schedule it, and clearly I have for this example, you can find the duration in days of each work breakdown structure node and its costs. This one for a product called the Customer Help Desk. And as you can see, this is just a tiny portion of the real work breakdown structure. And here I've split into the help desk screens, showing the number hierarchy, the name of the product or deliverable, and the cost and the budget, as well as the duration of each. So you'll find in the latest PMBOK that the work breakdown structure should be based on project deliverables rather than just tasks. But there's one vital piece missing here that training courses seem to miss, even though it might be covered later. Check out something called the quality metrics. These should be defined for each product deliverable and then go on to be verified after the product has been created. Those quality metrics are often missed out early on, and I want to show you why and how they should be included within planning. Good, well that brings us to the end of part 1. Do join me, Dave Litton, from the Projex Academy in part 2, where you and I will continue with your journey into mastering the 23 PMP planning processes. So, bye for now.